I found it on a Tuesday afternoon. A hotel keycard, pale gold, slipped into the pocket of my husband's jacket. I had never been to that hotel. I was 8 months pregnant. My feet were swollen. My back ached. And I was standing in our bedroom. The bedroom in the house he bought. The house I decorated. The house I had quietly made into a home, while slowly, without realizing it, unmaking myself. I stood there holding that small piece of gold plastic. And I knew. Not just about the affair. I knew something deeper. Something I had been refusing to see for 4 years. I had disappeared. Not all at once, not dramatically, piece by piece. A career set aside. A laugh made quieter. An opinion swallowed. A woman who used to argue about architecture and fill a room, reduced, slowly and completely, to the woman who managed a calendar and chose paint colors and asked nothing of the space she was given. I was 32 years old, 8 months pregnant, standing in someone else's life, and in that moment, holding that keycard, I decided to leave. Not in anger, not in revenge, in something colder and more powerful than either, in clarity. This is the story of what happened next, what I said, what I did, and the 2 minutes and 14 seconds that left my billionaire husband standing frozen in an empty kitchen, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to unhear the truest thing anyone had ever said to him. Stay with me, because this story is not just mine. The lesson this story carries: you do not lose yourself all at once. It happens quietly, in small surrenders, across years of choosing someone else's comfort over your own truth. And the way back is not dramatic. It is deliberate. It is one honest decision at a time, until the day you look in the mirror and recognize the person looking back. If this story speaks to something you have felt, something you have lived, or are living right now, please like this video. Leave a comment. Share it with one woman who needs to hear it today. And subscribe to this channel, because every story here is built for women who are ready to stop disappearing.
The jacket was on the armchair again. It was always on the armchair. Derek had a closet the size of a small bedroom, with custom cedar shelves and a valet system that Patricia had organized twice already. And still, the jacket ended up on the armchair by the bedroom door. Claire noticed it from the hallway. She noticed it the way she noticed most things in this house now. Quietly, without comment, the way you notice water stains on a ceiling you've stopped planning to fix. She shifted the laundry basket to her left hip. Her lower back had been aching since morning. 8 months of pregnancy had rearranged her entire center of gravity, and she moved differently now. More carefully, more deliberately, like a building that had added a new floor without reinforcing the foundation. She set the basket down, picked up the jacket. It was expensive. Everything in this house was expensive. She had stopped noticing that too. She checked the pockets before tossing it in the laundry. Old habit. Derek left things in his pockets: receipts, mints, business cards he collected at events, and never followed up on. She had been checking his pockets for 4 years. She never thought anything of it. Left pocket, empty. Right pocket. Her fingers closed around something small, rectangular, hard plastic with a slight ridge along one edge. She pulled it out. A hotel keycard, pale gold, a silver logo embossed in the center. The Grand Beaumont Hotel. She held it up, looked at it in the afternoon light coming through the bedroom window, turned it over. The back was blank, just the magnetic strip, just the mute evidence of a room somewhere that she had never been in. She had never been to the Grand Beaumont. Her mind started moving, automatic, involuntary, the way a body moves when it knows something the brain hasn't caught up to yet. Work event, client, dinner, networking function, conference. But she would know about a conference. She managed Derek's travel calendar. That was something she had taken on 2 years ago. when she stopped working and needed something to do with the precision that used to go into load calculations and structural drawings. She knew his schedule the way she used to know blueprints. Every line, every detail. There was no Grand Beaumont on the calendar. She looked at the keycard for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone. She dialed the hotel's main number. She didn't know why she was doing this. Some part of her was already 3 steps ahead, already knew the answer, already understood what this small piece of gold plastic meant. But that part hadn't reached her hands yet. Her hands were dialing. 1 ring, 2. Grand Beaumont Hotel. How may I assist you? The voice was professional, pleasant, unhelpful in advance. Hello, Claire said. Her own voice surprised her, level, clear, like she was calling about a restaurant reservation. I found a key card. I'm trying to return it. Can you tell me which room this belongs to? A brief pause, the sound of keys clicking. I'm sorry, ma'am. That card shows as deactivated. The room was checked out 3 days ago. 3 days ago. And the name on the reservation? Claire asked. Another pause, longer. I'm not able to share that information. I'm sorry. Of course, Claire said. Thank you. She hung up. She sat down on the edge of the bed. Not because she chose to sit, because her legs made the decision without consulting her. 3 days ago was Thursday. Thursday, Derek had texted her at 6 in the evening. Client dinner. Running late. Don't wait up. She had not waited up. She had put on her pregnancy pillow, found a comfortable position for her enormous belly, and fallen asleep watching a documentary about Japanese woodworking techniques. She had no memory of it ending. She woke at 2 in the morning to drink water, and Derek was in bed beside her, and she had thought nothing of it. She had thought nothing of it. The keycard was still in her hand. The Grand Beaumont logo in understated silver. Mirror technique. Moment 1. She looked at her phone. She opened the screen. She navigated to Derek's location sharing. Her thumb hovered over the icon. She locked the phone. She waited. She unlocked it. She navigated back to the same screen. She locked the phone again, 3 times. Lock, navigate, stop, lock. She set the phone face down on the bed. She understood, in this moment, something she had always judged in other women. The women in movies and in her friend Rose's stories who already knew and still couldn't look. She had always thought she would be different. She had always been certain she was the kind of woman who looked directly at things. She was sitting on the edge of her own bed at 3 in the afternoon, 8 months pregnant, doing the exact thing she swore she would never do. Not looking, because looking meant knowing, and knowing meant the end of something. And the end of something, right now, felt like standing at the edge of a very long drop. She put the key card in the pocket of her cardigan. She picked up the laundry basket. She walked downstairs. The washing machine was in the utility room off the kitchen. She loaded it carefully, lowering herself to reach the lower items, feeling the familiar protest of her lower back. She added detergent. She set the cycle. She pressed start. The machine began its low, rhythmic churning. She went to the kitchen window. There was a magnolia tree in the backyard. It had been blooming when they moved in. Derek had called it one of the selling points of the property. She remembered nodding, agreeing, thinking, yes, the magnolia is lovely. What she had actually loved about the house was the north-facing windows and what was supposed to be her studio. Perfect light for drafting. Cool, consistent, without the distortion of direct sun. She had stood in that empty room before they signed the papers and felt something open up in her chest. Possibility. Space. She never got to use those windows the way she planned. The coffee was already cold. She had made it an hour ago and forgotten it. She wrapped both hands around the mug anyway. You already know. The thought arrived quietly. No drama, just a statement of fact, the way a structural report arrives with findings, matter of fact, inevitable. She had known for longer than 3 days. She understood this now. There had been other small things. A perfume she didn't recognize on his collar one morning in September. A text conversation she caught a fragment of when he left his phone face up on the counter. Just the preview, just a few words, but the words had a particular register that she had noticed and then decided not to notice. The way he started keeping his phone face up instead of face down, as if he was performing innocence so deliberately he had forgotten the difference. But suspicion is not knowledge, and she had been very careful all these months not to let suspicion become investigation, because investigation meant confirmation, and confirmation meant a decision, and a decision at 8 months pregnant, with no income of her own, with her professional identity 3 years faded, with her entire daily life organized around this house and this man and this marriage. A decision like that required a kind of courage she was not sure she had. The magnolia tree stood still in the October yard, all its leaves, no wind. The baby kicked, hard, once, a clear, deliberate movement just under her ribs. Claire put her free hand on her belly. "I know," she said, quietly, to no one, to her daughter, to herself. "Me too." She stood at the kitchen window until the light changed. Then she went upstairs. She ran a bath. She made it deeper than usual. She lowered herself into it with the practiced care of a woman who has learned to move through water at 8 months pregnant. Slowly, with attention, trusting the buoyancy to do what gravity has been undoing, she lay back. The ceiling of the master bath was high, white. A pendant light she had chosen herself 3 years ago from a catalog she spent an entire afternoon going through. She remembered feeling pleased with the choice. Small domestic victories. She lay in the warm water, and she looked at the ceiling, and she stayed completely still. Not because she was calm, because she was memorizing the quiet. Some part of her understood, with architectural precision, that after this week, things were going to be very loud for a very long time, and she wanted this. These last minutes of before. The front door opened downstairs, footsteps in the entry hall, the particular rhythm of Derek's walk, the sound of keys on the hook by the door, his voice carrying up the stairs, slightly too bright, the brightness of a man performing a normal evening. "Claire, you home?" She counted to 10. "In the bath," she called back. Her voice was perfect, level, warm, the voice of a woman with nothing to hide. She was already someone he did not fully know. The morning came in gray and cold. Claire was awake before the alarm. She had been awake since 4. She lay in the dark and listened to Derek's breathing and thought about the Grand Beaumont Hotel and the magnolia tree and the particular quality of silence in a house that holds a secret. At 6:30, Derek's alarm went off. He reached over and silenced it without fully waking. A trained reflex. He was good at trained reflexes. Claire lay still, eyes open, looking at the ceiling. He showered. She heard the water. She heard the specific sounds of his morning routine. The cabinet that clicked, the drawer that stuck slightly, the exhale he always made before stepping out of the shower. 4 years of proximity had given her the entire score of his mornings. She knew his mornings the way she no longer knew him. At 7:15, they were both in the kitchen. Derek was making coffee, the expensive machine, the beans from that subscription he'd started 2 years ago, sourced from a specific region of Ethiopia. The process was deliberate and specific and slightly performative, the way all his rituals were. "Ethiopian blend today," he said. New shipment came in. He said it the way people make conversation, when conversation is not what they mean. Claire sat at the kitchen island, And she watched him, not the way she used to watch him, not with the soft blur of familiarity, the automatic filter of love that rounds off every sharp angle. She watched him the way she used to observe a site before beginning a project, objectively, with distance, trying to understand the structure beneath the surface. He was 39 years old. His hair was silvering at the temples in a way that photographs well, and that he was aware of, and that she used to find distinguished. He was wearing the gray cashmere sweater she bought him last Christmas. He was talking about coffee beans. He had no idea. Layer 2 begins here. She ran the question through herself very quietly. Who is this person? She went back through the history, the way you scroll through a file, looking for a specific date. She went back to the beginning. They met at a design and technology conference in San Francisco. She was 31. She had been 3 years into her architecture career, working on a mixed-use residential project in Lower Manhattan that she was genuinely proud of. Complex and satisfying work. The kind that made her stay late because she wanted to, not because she had to. He had been charming. She needed to be honest about that. Actually charming, not the polished surface of a man who has learned charm as a technique. Something warmer than that. He remembered things she said. He asked about her projects with what felt like real curiosity. He said, on their third date, across a small table in a restaurant she'd suggested, "You're the most interesting person in any room you walk into. Do you know that?" She had not known that. She wanted to. She believed him. That was the beginning of it. Not the marriage, not even the relationship. That was the beginning of the erosion. The moment she started seeing herself through his eyes instead of her own. The moment his opinion of her became more real to her than her own. 2 years of dating, during which her career gradually became the thing they discussed less. His company grew. She began traveling with him. She began organizing, first informally, and then completely, the logistics of his professional life alongside her own. The efficiency she used to pour into structural drawings started flowing, piece by piece, into Derek's calendar. She told herself it was partnership. She told herself it was love. The first time she mentioned returning to her own projects, Derek had not been angry. He had been concerned. That particular gentle frown. "Are you sure you want that stress right now? We're about to start trying for a baby." That was 2 years ago. She did not go back to work. The baby shifted now against her ribs. A slow, stretching movement. Alive and insistent. Derek was setting a mug in front of her. "Decaf," he said. Small smile. The smile she used to love. Obviously. She took the mug. She looked at his face. The thought arrived without announcement, flat and certain as a calculation. "I don't know you. I'm not sure I ever did." Mirror technique. Moment 2. The counter was between them. It was always between them. She tried to remember the last time they sat side by side somewhere, actually beside each other, without a table or a counter, or a distance between them. She thought back through the last year, the year before that. She could not find an image. She kept coming up empty. The conversation continued. Normal, unremarkable. He asked about her prenatal appointment. She said Thursday. He said he would try to make it. His voice carrying the specific flatness of someone saying something they have already decided against. She said that was fine. Her voice carrying the specific warmth of someone who has stopped expecting. They had been performing this marriage for longer than she realized. The performance was very good. That was the terrifying part. Derek left at 8, kissed her forehead, checked his phone twice before the front door closed. She heard his car back out of the driveway. She watched the kitchen window until the sound of his engine faded. Then she sat in the quiet. At 9, Patricia came in through the back door. Patricia had been with them for 6 years. She was a woman of 57, with strong opinions about grout cleanliness and a gift for discretion that Claire had always appreciated. She worked with near silence, moving through the rooms with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that a house is not just a place to live, but a system to maintain. This morning, Patricia's routine broke. She came into the kitchen. She went to the counter by the coffee maker. She set something down, a single piece of paper placed with the deliberate care of someone doing something they have thought about doing for some time. Then she walked out of the kitchen without a word. Claire looked at the paper. It was a page from the household expense account, the account Patricia managed, the one Claire had never reviewed because the system ran smoothly and she trusted it and she had stopped paying attention. The page was open to September and October. The Grand Beaumont Hotel appeared 7 times, 7 charges, 7 visits, 8 weeks. She counted them. Once. She counted them again. 7. She folded the paper with great care. The way you fold something important. The way you handle evidence. She tucked it inside her cardigan, against her chest, for no logical reason except that her body needed to hold it close before her mind could decide what to do with it. She walked to the window, October light, cold and precise and without mercy. Affirmation whisper. First, she said it out loud. She was alone. The kitchen was quiet except for the refrigerator hum and the distant sound of Patricia in the hallway. I'm not crazy. I know what I saw. Her voice did not shake. I'm not crazy. I know what I saw. The words were different when spoken, more solid, more real, more hers. She stood at the window until the October light stopped feeling like something to survive. Then she walked to the small room at the back of the house. The room that was supposed to be her studio. The breathing space scene arrives here, and it is near silent. She had not been in this room in months. It had become a repository of things without a proper home. Boxes from Derek's old apartment that they never fully unpacked. Wedding gifts they never opened. Still in tissue paper and box. Her drafting supplies in their leather cases, gathering the specific dust of good intentions. Her old drafting chair was still in the corner by the window. The north-facing window. The window with the perfect light. She sat down in the chair. Her old ergonomic chair, the one she bought herself the year she passed her licensure exam. It still fit. It still felt exactly right, even with the strange new geometry of her pregnancy reshaping her lap. She just sat. She did not cry. She did not plan. She did not make lists or decisions or assessments. She looked at the window and the thin, honest October light coming through it. She breathed. Something in her chest, tightly compressed for longer than she could accurately measure, loosened at its edges, just slightly, just enough. She stayed in that room until the light shifted and the baby's movements reminded her that a body needed more than grief and clarity. It needed water, food. Forward motion. She got up. She went back to the kitchen. She drank a glass of water, standing at the sink. She began, very quietly, to plan. Rose arrived at noon with lentil soup and sourdough bread and the specific energy of a woman bracing for something she can feel but cannot yet name. They had been friends for 11 years, since a statistics class in their second year of college, that both of them were taking as a required course and neither of them wanted. Rose had leaned over and whispered, "If this is what numbers do to people, I'm becoming an English teacher." Claire had laughed so loudly, the professor stopped mid-sentence. They had been inseparable for about 6 years after that, and then gradually separable the way adult friendships go. Phone calls instead of dinners. Texts instead of calls. The slow drift of different schedules and different lives. But the foundation never moved. It was the kind of friendship you could step back into after 3 weeks of silence and find exactly where you left it. Rose set the soup on the stove and the bread on the counter and turned to look at Claire with the directness of someone who has already assessed the situation from the doorway and is not going to pretend otherwise. "You look terrible," she said, with great affection. "Thank you," Claire said. "Not terrible, terrible. Just." Rose tilted her head. "Something's happened." "Something has happened." They sat at the breakfast nook. The light was good there. Always good in the morning, even in October. Claire had chosen this house partly for this light, and she had never told Derek that either. For the first 20 minutes, they talked about other things. This was their ritual, and Claire was grateful for it. Rose talked about a student who had turned in a short story that was, quote, accidentally a masterpiece. The kid has no idea. And another student who had submitted something that Rose described as a manifesto for something I'm legally not allowed to name. Claire laughed, the real laugh, the loud one she didn't usually let out in this house. Then Rose stopped talking. She just looked at Claire, and Claire reached into her cardigan and took out the folded paper and slid it across the table. Rose read it. Claire watched her face. The progression was its own paragraph. Confusion first, the small frown of someone trying to understand what they're looking at, then recognition, the slow arrival of understanding, then a particular anger, not her own, but Claire's, borrowed and carried on Claire's behalf, the specific fury of a person who loves someone and is watching them be hurt. "How long?" Rose said. Not a question, a calculation. At least 8 weeks from the charges, probably longer. Claire, I know. I'm functioning, Claire said. I'm not fine, but I'm thinking clearly. You're 8 months pregnant. I'm aware. Rose set the paper down. She folded her hands on the table. She took a slow breath, the specific kind that precedes something important. I need to tell you something, she said. Her voice had changed. Careful now, ashamed. Something in Claire's chest went still. I've been sitting on this for 3 months, Rose said. I convinced myself I wasn't certain. I told myself I was protecting you. I understand now that I was being a coward. 3 months. Tell me, Claire said. Rose told her. June. Derek's company fundraiser. Claire had been inside the whole evening, gracious and organized and invisible in the way she had become good at, managing the flow of the event she had planned entirely. Rose had stepped outside for air and found Derek in the garden in conversation with a woman, tall, dark-haired, polished in that specific way that money and ambition together produce. They were talking. That wasn't the thing. It was the 40 minutes of it. It was the way the woman's hand rested on Derek's arm and the way Derek angled toward her, just slightly, the lean of a person toward something they have already privately chosen. It wasn't anything definitive, Rose said. I know that, but I knew. I think I knew immediately, and I talked myself out of it for 3 months because I didn't want to be the person who told you. The table between them was quiet. I'm sorry, Rose said. I should have told you in June. Claire was quiet for a moment. She let the information sit. She let the additional layer of it land. Not just Derek, also Rose. Also 3 months of Tuesday lunches and phone calls and careful, loving silence. You should have, she said. Not with cruelty, with the clean precision of a simple truth. I know. But you're telling me now, Claire said. So, something settled between them, not comfortable, but honest. The specific relief of two people who have stopped managing the truth. After the soup, after the careful hugs, and Rose's promise to be reachable at any hour, after the sound of Rose's car leaving the driveway, Claire walked to the small back room. The studio, the storage room. She still didn't know what to call it. She went to the cabinet in the corner. She didn't fully know why her feet took her there. Something in her needed the past right now, needed to find the before and hold it against the after to see the distance. She opened the cabinet. Her old architecture portfolio was on the second shelf. The physical version, leather-bound, her name embossed on the corner in the way she had thought was modest at the time and now seemed essential. Claire Marsh, her name before the marriage, her professional name, the name under which she had spent 6 years building something real. She took the portfolio to her chair. She opened it. The first project, a residential complex in Brooklyn, 42 units, mixed income. She had worked on it for 11 months, staying until 9 or 10 most nights, not because she was required to, but because the problem kept interesting her. She remembered the specific satisfaction of solving the ventilation challenge in the corner units. She remembered the lead architect saying, at the final review, "This is better than my solution." She had been 28 years old. She had been so proud she couldn't speak. She turned the pages. A waterfront development in New Jersey. A community library proposal for a national competition. A small boutique hotel in upstate New York that she had designed pro bono for a family friend and that had won a regional design award the year before she left the firm. She looked at these things. She expected to feel nostalgic, some warm softness about the past. Instead, she felt grief. Not for the marriage, not for Derek, for herself, for the woman who made these things, who argued with senior partners about load distribution and won, who had a specific and strongly held opinion about north-facing light in reading rooms, who stayed late because the problem was interesting, who laughed loudly and wore her hair down and took up space in a room without apologizing for it. Layer 3 fully present now. When did she stop being that woman? She looked at the library proposal, the reading room. She had fought for the north-facing orientation. The lead architect had wanted south for the light drama. She had said, with the certainty of 29 years and 3 years of professional conviction, South light is beautiful. North light is livable. A library needs to be livable. She had won. She had fought for what she believed, and she had won, and she had gone home that night and called her mother, and they had talked for an hour about the project, and about light, and about what buildings are for. When was the last time she called her mother and talked for an hour? She couldn't find the date. Mirror technique moment 3. She reached for her phone. She went to the photo roll. She scrolled back, past the pregnancy photos, past last Christmas, past the wedding, past the early marriage years, where the photographs had the slightly performed quality of two people still figuring out who they were together. She found it. 4 years ago, a project site in Brooklyn. She was wearing a hard hat slightly too large for her head, a dusty jacket. She was laughing at something the site foreman had said, her mouth completely open, her hair loose under the hard hat, her whole face unself-conscious and bright. She looked like herself. She looked like someone she used to know so intimately that she hadn't noticed when that person left. She stared at the photograph. She put it down. She opened her laptop. She found her old design software from habit, the program she had used for 6 years. She opened a new file. She did not design anything. She looked at the blank grid, the precise intersections of possibility. The clean white space waiting to become something. She sat in the October afternoon with the north-facing window and the blank grid, and her old drafting chair and her grandmother's quilt draped over the chair's arm for no reason except that she'd carried it in here that morning without thinking. She sat until the room went dark around her. Then she said it. Affirmation whisper. Second, somewhere along the way, I became invisible. The words fell into the dark room. Somewhere along the way, I became invisible. And then, arriving before she understood where it came from, arriving with a force that surprised her. I'm not going to be invisible anymore. She said it clearly. She set it to the blank grid and the north-facing window and the portfolio of the woman she used to be. Something changed in the room when she said it. Some quality of the air. She opened a new browser tab. She typed in the name of an architecture firm she had admired for 6 years. She found their website. She looked at their current projects. She read their philosophy statement. She closed the laptop. Not yet, but she was looking forward. For the first time in a very long time, she was looking forward. She did not confront him immediately. This surprised her. She had always assumed, in the theoretical way you plan hypothetical crises from a safe distance, that discovery would produce explosion. She had pictured herself incandescent, voice raised, things possibly thrown. The full dramatic register of betrayal she had absorbed from years of films and books, and Rose's secondhand accounts of other people's disasters. Instead, she spent 3 days being very still. Not the performance of stillness, not patience, something colder. She was watching Derek the way you watch a structure you're assessing for damage, looking for load-bearing failures, invisible cracks in the foundation. She found them everywhere. The way he held his phone now, always angled away, not aggressively, but consistently. The way he mentioned Natalie Pierce's name twice in 3 days in the context of work, both times with a neutrality so deliberate it was its own kind of signal. The way he looked at her, the specific softness of a man who is managing his guilt by performing kindness, extra considerate, extra attentive, the attentiveness of someone who is compensating. On the 3rd day, in the evening, she called Patricia. "The hotel charges," she said. "Yes, Ms. Weston." A pause. "I thought you should know." "Do you know her name?" The pause stretched. "Her name is Natalie Pierce," Patricia said carefully. "She's a vice president at the company. I've heard Mr. Weston mention her on calls. I wasn't completely certain until I checked the charges against the dates." "Thank you, Patricia." "Mrs. Weston, please, call me Claire." A small pause. Something in the air of it shifted. "Claire, are you all right?" "I will be," Claire said, and she almost believed it. The confrontation happened on a Wednesday. She made dinner. She didn't fully understand why. Some automation of habit, some residual hospitality running beneath the decision she had already made. She set the table the way she always set it, 2 places. Candles she did not light. Derek came home at 8. He came into the kitchen with his jacket over his arm and his phone in his hand and the practiced ease of a man arriving at a life he believes is still intact. He saw the table. He saw her. He saw, on the table in front of his chair, the hotel expense sheet and the Grand Beaumont keycard placed side by side with the deliberate precision of evidence. His face moved through several things very quickly. Confusion first, performed, then recognition, real, then the collapse. Not dramatic, not a crumbling, just a quiet deflation, like a building settling. "Claire, sit down," she said. He sat. She looked at his face from across the table. She had expected to feel her chest split open. She had expected the anger to arrive like a wave. Instead, she felt the way she felt on a building site before the first pour. Very clear, very level, every measurement checked. "How long?" she said. He started with the script. She let him say it. The whole sentence. "It isn't what you think." She let it finish. "The Grand Beaumont Hotel," she said. 7 visits in 8 weeks. Her name is Natalie Pierce. She is your vice president of marketing. You have been paying for the hotel from the household account." She paused. "How long?" He was quiet. The script had been used up. What remained underneath it was smaller than she expected. He looked less like a man facing the ruins of a great betrayal and more like a child caught in a lie about something ordinary. The scale of the thing was wrong. She had expected something enormous and dark. She found something diminished and pale. Layer 4, the mundanity of him. 4 months, he said. 4 months. Claire, it was... He stopped. He tried again. It was a mistake. I'm 8 months pregnant, she said. She said it very quietly, not as an accusation, as a fact she was presenting for examination. The way you present a fact that speaks for itself and requires no additional comment. He flinched. Good. I know, he said. I know, and Don't, she said. He stopped. She looked at his face for a long moment, looking at the structure of him, looking for something she might have missed, some depth she hadn't accounted for, some explanation that would make this larger than it appeared. She didn't find it. Affirmation whisper. Third. She's not the problem, Claire said. He stared at her. Natalie Pierce is not the problem, she said. You are not even the main problem anymore. She paused, and what she said next, arrived from somewhere she hadn't known, was ready. The problem is that I spent 4 years making myself smaller in this marriage. I watched myself disappear, and I said nothing. I chose nothing. That's what I'm actually angry about. Derek was looking at the tablecloth. I need you to leave tonight, she said. I'll stay here with the baby. You can go to Brendan's. You can go to a hotel. She picked up the key card from the table. She held it out. Take this, I won't be needing it. He took it. She stood. She was enormous and still and absolutely present. Derek, she said. He looked up. You never knew me? Not the real version. You knew the version that had made herself convenient. You knew the quiet version. She picked up her water glass from the table. She held it without drinking. The one who stopped arguing. The one who stopped taking up space. That was never who I was. You just met me when I was still deciding how much of myself to give away. She set the glass down. I'd like you to be gone before I come back downstairs. She walked out of this dining room. Behind her, the sound of him not moving. The sound of a man sitting with the accounting of something he cannot balance. She walked up the stairs. She sat on the edge of the guest room bed. She heard Derek's phone. She heard his voice, low, making a call. She heard some minutes later the sound of his footsteps on the stairs, the brief quiet of the bedroom, the sound of a bag, the stairs again, the front door, his car in the driveway, the engine, gone. The breathing space scene. She ran a bath. She filled it until the water was almost too hot, and there was steam rising off the surface. She lowered herself in, still wearing the linen dress she had put on that morning. She did not take it off. She simply lowered herself into the water, and the fabric ballooned around her enormous belly and clung to her arms, and the hem rose around her like something from a dream. She lay back. The water closed around her. The dress clung. She looked at the ceiling, the pendant light she had chosen from the catalog 3 years ago. An afternoon of careful looking. She put both hands on her belly. The baby was still. The particular stillness of a child who has gone quiet in sympathy, as if even 8 months of growing had taught her to understand when silence is what is needed. The water dripped from the faucet, a slow and regular sound. Once, pause, again. She lay in the warmth and the steam and the soaked fabric, and she let the evening exist around her. She did not plan, she did not grieve, she did not perform anything for anyone, not even herself. She was alone, she was warm, she was still breathing. That was enough for this hour. That was exactly enough. She spoke once, to her belly, to the child, to herself. We're going to be okay, she said. The water dripped. The faucet, once, pause, again, 2 in the morning. The house had a different quality at this hour. Larger somehow, more honest. The rooms gave up their daytime pretenses and became simply spaces. walls, air, the accumulated meaning of the people who had lived inside them. Claire was in the guest room. She had not been able to return to the master bedroom. The geometry of that room was wrong now. Too much absence in the wrong place. The guest room was neutral. White walls, a good mattress with new sheets she had bought 2 years ago for visitors they rarely had. Her grandmother's quilt was over her legs. It smelled like the house she had grown up visiting. Something floral and deep and old. The specific smell of a woman who had lived fully and well, and whose things still carried her presence. The baby was awake. Small movements against her ribs. Shifting. The particular restlessness of a child who has not yet learned the schedule. Claire lay in the dark. Layer 5 arrives now, arriving slowly, the way real things do. Who am I? Not who will I be? That was a daytime question, a planning question, a question for the version of herself that was capable of forward movement. This was the night question. This was the underneath question. She lay in the dark and let it come, the full weight of it, without the title of Derek Weston's wife, which she was choosing in this dark room to put down permanently. Who remained? She assembled the inventory with the systematic precision of a person trained to assess structures. She was a woman who had not designed a building in 3 years. She was a woman whose most recent professional reference was 4 years old. She was a woman who had let her licensure renewal lapse 18 months ago without mentioning it to anyone because she had stopped thinking of it as something she would need. She was a woman who had, in the last 2 years, organized charity events, managed household staff, selected the interior palette for 3 rooms, planned dinner parties for Derek's associates, and compiled his conference travel schedule. None of those things were hers. She was 8 months pregnant. She was alone in a guest room. She was afraid. The terror had no object. There was nothing in this room to fear. No threat, no danger, no one making demands. The house was quiet. The baby was alive. She had resources. Not many of her own, but some. A small savings account she had maintained from before the marriage. Her mother. Rose, and yet. Mirror technique. Moment 4. She picked up her phone. She opened the browser. She typed her own name, her professional name. Claire Marsh, architect. The search results came back. Old articles, her old firm's project pages, a mention in an industry publication from 5 years ago, and there, her old professional website, still live, apparently, still cached somewhere in the internet's long memory. She clicked on it. Her photograph, the professional headshot from when she was 28. She was looking directly at the camera with the specific confidence of someone who has not yet learned to doubt themselves. Dark hair loose, a plain blazer, not trying, just present. She read her own bio. Claire Marsh is a licensed architect specializing in residential and mixed-use developments. She believes the most important thing a building can do is make people feel recognized. She read that last sentence 3 times. Make people feel recognized. She started to cry. Not the operatic grief she had expected all week. Not the heaving and dramatic thing. The quiet kind. The private kind. The kind that happens when you finally look directly at something you have been walking carefully around for years. She cried for 6 minutes. She knew this because she watched the clock on her phone. Then she stopped. She blew her nose on the corner of her grandmother's quilt. Her grandmother would have approved. Her grandmother had strong opinions about using what's available. She lay back. She was still afraid. But the fear was real now, not managed, not suppressed into the neat corners of an orderly life, real and present and hers, that felt, strange as it was, like something. At 9 in the morning, Derek's business partner called. Brendan Cole. She had known him for 4 years. She had organized a birthday dinner for his wife. She had attended the launch of the company's second platform at his side. She had considered him, in a general and untested way, a friend. She answered because she needed to hear what he would say. Claire, how are you? Brendan, did you know? The pause told her everything before the words arrived. Claire, how long did you know? 3 months, he said. 3 months. I should have. My best friend knew for 3 months, she said. His business partner knew for 3 months. She paused. I'm 8 months pregnant. Were you all just waiting for me to find out myself? I told myself it wasn't my place. You've known me for 4 years. Her voice stayed level. She was surprised by this. You were at my wedding. You held the door when I was leaving the hospital after my first trimester scare. I called you that night because Derek was in Singapore and I didn't know who else to call. Silence on the line. It was your place, Brendan. You're right, he said very quietly. I'm sorry. She hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand. She thought about the specific way silence works as complicity, how choosing not to speak is still a choice, how every person who watched this happening and said nothing had been, in their own small way, part of the architecture of her isolation. Affirmation whisper. Fourth, I deserved better than this, she said. I deserved people who would say something. Not with rage, with the clarity of a fact. I deserved better than this. She got up. She opened her contact list. She found the number she had saved 8 months ago during a bad night in her second trimester when Derek had come home 3 hours late, smelling of a restaurant she hadn't heard of. She had saved the number as a kind of private insurance, something she hoped she would never need. Margaret Ford, Family Law. She looked at it. She moved it to her favorites. Not yet, but getting there. The decision was forming now. Not fully shaped, still gaining mass, the way a storm gains mass, gathering what it needs from the surrounding air. She showered. She dressed. She went downstairs. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the table where the confrontation had happened. The candles she had not lit. The 2 places set. She cleared the table. She folded the tablecloth. She made herself breakfast. She sat at the kitchen island, and she ate, and she looked out the window at the magnolia tree, and she thought about north-facing light, and about the woman in the photograph on the old website, and about the thing she had said in the dark studio room. I am not going to be invisible anymore. She had said it. She had meant it. Now came the work. The prenatal appointment was at 10. Claire drove herself. She had been driving herself to prenatal appointments for 2 months, since it became clear that Derek's promise to attend them existed primarily as a promise. She had stopped minding. The appointments were hers. The time in the car was hers. The particular small joy of hearing Eleanor's heartbeat on the monitor was hers. She drove with the radio off. She was learning to prefer quiet. The waiting room of the practice had the specific palette of spaces designed to calm. Soft greens and warm whites and framed prints of soft focus meadows. A water feature in the corner that produced a sound like a very small and polite stream. Chairs upholstered in something that looked like wool. She checked in. She found a chair near the window. She sat with her coat in her lap and her hands folded over her belly, and she thought about Margaret Ford and about the firm she had looked up the night before and about Eleanor's room, the seafoam walls, the unassembled crib still in its box. The door opened. A woman came in. Tall, dark-haired, expensive without trying, the specific kind of polished that comes from very good bones and slightly too much self-consciousness about them. She went to the reception desk. She said something in a low voice. She turned to find a seat. She looked across the waiting room. She saw Claire. Recognition arrived on her face like a cold wave, the specific blanching of someone who has, in an instant, come face to face with the human weight of something they have been keeping carefully abstract. She stood in the middle of the waiting room. She did not move. Claire looked at her. Natalie Pierce, 38 years old, Vice President of Marketing at Weston Digital. The woman who had been in the Grand Beaumont Hotel 7 times in 8 weeks, the woman who had rested her hand on Derek's arm in the garden at the June fundraiser while Claire was inside accepting compliments. She was, in person, more ordinary than Claire had imagined. Not smaller, just human. Just a person who had made a series of choices, the way all people do, and found herself standing in a waiting room across from the consequence of them. Layer 6 begins here, arriving quietly. Claire spoke first. "I know who you are," she said. Her voice was completely level. Natalie opened her mouth, closed it. "I'm not going to yell at you," Claire said. "I have a prenatal appointment, and I'm not raising my blood pressure over this." Something moved across Natalie's face, the beginning of relief. Then something else, something more complicated. "Sit down if you like," Claire said. She gestured to the chair diagonal to her own. "Or don't. That's your choice." Natalie sat. They were quiet for a moment. The water feature made its small, polite sound. Someone across the room turned a page in a magazine. "He told you we were over," Claire said. "That it had been over for years, that we were basically roommates." Natalie looked at the floor. "He told you that you were the one who understood him," Claire continued. "That I never really knew him. That what he had with you was different." Natalie's jaw was tight. "He said it in that specific way he has," Claire said. "That particular way of speaking where you feel like the most seen person in the room. Like he's saying something just for you. Like no one has ever said it to him before." "Stop," Natalie said. Low, rough. "I'm not saying it to hurt you," Claire said. "I'm saying it because I spent 4 years in that story, and I would like someone to tell you what it is before you spend 4 years in the same one." Natalie looked up. Her eyes were wet. She did not look like a villain. She did not look like someone who had calculated harm and chosen it anyway. She looked like a woman who had told herself a story and was beginning, in this particular moment, in this particular fluorescent-lit waiting room, to understand that the story had a different shape than she had believed. "He told me you hadn't loved each other in years," she said. "He said you'd been going through the motions. He told me that in the same month, he helped me choose paint colors for the baby's room," Claire said. "Seafoam green. Because I mentioned once that I found it calming." Natalie closed her eyes. The water feature. The magazine page. The sound of a name being called from the inner corridor. Someone else's name, not either of theirs. "I'm sorry," Natalie said. "I know," Claire said. "I think you actually are." The nurse called Claire's name. She gathered her coat and her bag. She stood. She was enormous and present and entirely unashamed. She looked at Natalie once more. "Find someone who doesn't have a pregnant wife at home," she said, not unkindly, with the calm directness of someone who has recently learned to say true things simply. "You deserve that. Everybody does." She walked through the inner door. Mirror technique. Moment 5. In the examination room, waiting for the technician, she caught her own reflection in the narrow mirror mounted on the back of the door. She expected to look terrible. The sleeplessness, the stress, the week of contained upheaval. She looked different, not composed in the polished way of the life she was leaving, not neat or managed or appropriate, just fully present. Her face was entirely itself, with no performance running underneath it, as if everything that had been filtering her own expression had been quietly removed. She touched her jaw, her cheek, like greeting someone. The ultrasound was routine. Eleanor was 4 pounds and 2 ounces and perfectly positioned. Head down, ready. She's a strong one, the technician said. She is, Claire agreed. In the parking garage afterward, in the specific non-light of underground levels, Claire sat in her car and looked at her phone. She found Margaret Ford's number in her favorites. She pressed call. One ring. Margaret Ford? My name is Claire Weston. A friend gave me your number 2 years ago. I'd like to meet this week. A pause. I know who you are, Margaret said. Her voice was dry and level and precise, like something engineered for function. I was wondering when you'd call. Claire paused. Is tomorrow morning available? She asked. I'll make it available, Margaret said. Margaret Ford's office was on the 14th floor. The building had good bones. Claire noticed this immediately, and with the sharp pleasure of someone rediscovering a sense they thought they'd lost. She assessed it on the way up in the elevator. Steel and glass construction with a load-bearing core. High ceilings, probably 12 feet in the office, creating the particular kind of space that makes the people inside it feel capable. Large windows facing south, which gave the room light drama rather than livability. But in a lawyer's office, that choice made its own kind of sense. Margaret Ford was seated behind a desk that was exactly as functional as it needed to be, and not one item more. She was 52 years old, with the specific presence of a woman who had decided some years ago what she stood for and stopped renegotiating. Her handshake was firm. Her eyes were clear. She had a legal pad and a pen, and she pointed to the chair across from her desk without ceremony. Tell me everything, she said. Claire told her everything. The key card, the expense account, Patricia's paper left on the vanity, the confrontation, Derek's 4 months of admission, Brendan's 3 months of silence, Rose's 3 months of silence, the house, the studio, the north-facing windows, the portfolio, the woman she used to be. Margaret listened without interruption. She wrote in a small, exact hand. She did not offer expressions of sympathy or outrage. She listened with the total attention of someone who has made a professional commitment to accuracy. When Claire finished, Margaret set down her pen. Are you expecting? She said. A necessary question, Claire understood, not rhetorical. 5 weeks. The child's name? Eleanor? Margaret wrote it down. Do you have independent assets? A small savings account. I stopped working 3 years ago. My architecture license needs renewal. The house? Claire thought about the house, the expensive kitchen, the master bedroom she hadn't slept in for 2 weeks, the garden that employed a separate landscaping service, the guest room where she was sleeping now, with her grandmother's quilt and the drafting chair she had brought up from the studio. I want the north-facing room, she said. The studio on the ground floor. That's the room I care about. Margaret looked at her. The room, she repeated. It has the best light in the house. Margaret allowed something very small to cross her face. Not quite a smile, something adjacent. We'll negotiate a fair settlement that includes your career interruption, she said. 3 years out of the workforce, a licensure lapse, a newborn. The numbers will account for all of that. I'm not looking to devastate him, Claire said. You don't need to look for that, Margaret said. It will find its own level. They met for 2 hours. When Claire left the building, walking back through the lobby, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Agency. The specific and irreplaceable sense of being in motion. Not being moved, not drifting, not accommodating the motion of someone else's life. Moving. Under her own direction. Towards something she could see. Layer 6 deepens. The warming begins. The week that followed was not dramatic. It was quiet and deliberate and methodical in a way that Claire's life had not been in years. Not the organized efficiency of running Derek's household, something different, something that belonged to her. She reorganized the guest room. She moved the drafting chair from the studio upstairs, placed it by the window. She brought her portfolio upstairs. She stacked her old design books on the windowsill. She bought flowers from the grocery store, cheap daisies, yellow and ordinary, entirely unlike the weekly arrangements that arrived from the florist Derek had on account. She called her mother. Helen answered on this first ring, the way she always answered when she knew it was important. The way she had always known when it was important for 32 years, with the specific and inexplicable accuracy of a mother. "Tell me," Helen said. And Claire did. She told her all of it, the complete version, from the key card in the jacket pocket to Margaret Ford's 14th floor office. She told it steadily, without performance, and Helen listened to every word with her whole self, without interruption, without the instinct to fix or redirect or soften, just listened until Claire had said everything there was to say. When Claire finished, Helen was quiet for 10 seconds. "Do you need me to come?" she said. "Yes," Claire said. Then, because she was practicing, "I've needed you for a while. I was too embarrassed to say it." "You have nothing to be embarrassed about." "I know that now," Claire said. "I'm learning." Helen arrived the following morning. 2 suitcases and a pot of her mother's lemon chicken recipe and a large canvas bag of yarn she had been meaning to work through. She came in through the front door and walked through the house with the brisk assessment of a woman who has spent 61 years learning to read a room. She looked at the kitchen, the living room, the dining room table where the confrontation had happened. She said nothing. She went upstairs. She walked into the guest room. She saw the drafting chair by the window, the portfolio on the dresser, the yellow daisies in the water glass. She looked at these things for a moment. Mirror technique, moment 6. Then she looked at Claire. Something passed between them. The kind of passing that only moves between two people who share blood and survival, and the particular knowledge of what it costs to rebuild yourself after someone else's failure. No words carried it. It existed in the looking. "Nice chair," Helen said. "It's mine," Claire said. "I know," Helen said. They ate dinner together at the kitchen island, elbows on the counter, Helen serving the lemon chicken in bowls because the pot was still warm and there was no point in dirtying more dishes. Helen talked. Practical things first. Logistics of the coming weeks, the baby's arrival, arrangements, then less practical things. Her own life. The year after Claire's father left. The specific texture of the first morning she woke up alone in the house and decided to rearrange every piece of furniture. "Why the furniture?" Claire asked. "Because I needed the space to look different," Helen said. "I needed to see a room I had made, not one I was living in because someone else arranged it." Claire held her soup bowl, the warmth of it. "How long until it got easier?" she asked. "Difficult question to answer," Helen said. "It got different first, then it got interesting. Then, eventually, it got better." She looked at Claire. "The interesting part is actually the good part. Most people miss that because they're waiting for better." That night, they sat at the kitchen table, Helen knitting, Claire with her laptop, browsing the firm she had looked up, looking at their recent projects, looking at the team page, looking at the kind of work they were doing. "I used to be very good," Claire said. "You still are," Helen said. She did not look up from the yarn. "You just stopped doing it. Starting over at 32 with a newborn feels impossible," Claire said. "It felt impossible at 58 with an empty house," Helen said. "I did it anyway." Claire looked at her laptop, at the firm's project gallery, at a community center in Connecticut, with a north-facing reading room and honest materials. Affirmation whisper. 5th. Starting over feels impossible, she said, but staying is worse. Helen pulled the yarn through a stitch. That's the truest thing you've said in a long time. Claire opened her email. She had been drafting it for 4 days, 3 paragraphs. Her name, her background, her work, the specific projects she was proudest of, the way she wrote about light in a building, the way she described what she believed architecture was for. She attached the portfolio. She did not think about it. She pressed send. Then she closed the laptop. She put her hand on her belly. "Eleanor," she said, "I'm back." 4 weeks passed. They had the particular quality of late pregnancy weeks. Time moving too slowly, and then suddenly not at all. The world narrowed to the essential: the weight of the baby, the careful walks, the prenatal appointments, the gradual transfer of herself into new containers. The legal process moved steadily under Margaret's precise management. Derek had not contested the separation agreement. He had attempted twice to have a conversation with Claire about what they might still be to each other. Both times, she had said, with complete gentleness, "Derek, we're going to be good parents to Eleanor. That's what I'm focused on right now. That's what I need from you." He kept waiting for the anger. It never arrived in the form he expected. He did not understand, and perhaps never would, that the anger had converted entirely, that the fuel which might have burned as rage was running instead as clarity. As the steady, quiet energy she put into Eleanor, into the renewal of her architecture license, into the careful afternoon hours she spent at the drafting table by the guest room window, she heard from the firm on a Tuesday. The email was 3 paragraphs long. The senior partner had specific things to say about the library competition project, about the community room orientation, about her statement of design philosophy. They wanted to meet. They understood she was about to have a child. They were prepared to discuss a delayed start with part-time arrangements for the first months. She read it 4 times. She called Rose. Rose screamed into the phone, a genuine, full-throated scream of absolute joy. The baby kicked hard, in what Claire decided to interpret as solidarity. She laughed until tears came and kept coming, the different kind, the relief kind. Mirror Technique Moment 7. She went back to the firm's website. She found the Community Center project in New Haven. The interior photograph of the reading room. She zoomed in on the design note printed on the wall. It said, "The most important thing a building can do is make people feel recognized." Her own words, from her own old bio. Her own words, living in someone else's building. She had said them at 28, and she had meant them, and she had left them somewhere in the years of becoming invisible. And they had been in the world this whole time. They had been doing their work without her. She put her face in her hands. She breathed. She sat at the window with the north-facing October light on her face, and she breathed, and she understood something clearly. She had been going back to herself all along. Every choice of these last 5 weeks, the confrontation, the call to Margaret, the email to the firm, the drafting chair by the window, the daisies from the grocery store, each of those had been a step on a path she had started walking without knowing it. The path had been there the whole time. She just needed the wreckage to make her stop and look down. On the morning of her last full day in the house, she moved through every room, not frantically, not with ceremony, slowly, with full attention, the way you walk through a building for the final time when you are the architect and the project is complete and you are checking your own work before handing it over. She stood in the kitchen she had designed with the contractor, the specific tile, the pulls on the drawers, the window she had insisted on over the sink because she wanted to look out when she washed dishes. She walked through the dining room, the table where the confrontation had happened. She put her hand on the back of the chair she had sat in. She felt nothing dramatic, just the solid weight of a fact. She went upstairs, into the master bedroom. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room she had not slept in for 5 weeks. Her grandmother's quilt was not there. Her things were not there. The room had already released her. She went to the nursery, the sea foam walls, the unassembled crib still in its flat-pack box. The mobile Helen had made, small paper birds in blue and white, hung from a simple hook above where the crib would go. The soft chair in the corner. The bookshelf with the books she had been collecting for months. Board books and picture books, and the first chapter book she remembered loving because she had thought Eleanor should have it waiting. She stood in the seafoam room for a long time. "You were always going to be born into better than this," she said quietly. She talked to Eleanor the way she talked to buildings, explaining the intent, describing what the space was for. "I just needed to understand that first. I needed to lose enough of myself before I could find myself again. I'm sorry it took so long. I don't think I'll be sorry again." She went downstairs. She went to the kitchen. She set her phone against the fruit bowl, angled toward the room. She pressed record. She straightened her back. She put one hand on her belly. She looked at the camera. She spoke. 2 minutes, 14 seconds. She spoke at the pace of someone who has thought through every word and is choosing each one deliberately. Not performing for the camera. Speaking to Derek the way she should have spoken to him years ago, if she had been the version of herself she was becoming. "Derek, I want you to understand something. Not because I need you to agree, not because I need an apology. I have the apology. It wasn't enough, and it wasn't the point. I want you to understand what you lost. Not me, specifically. Who I was when we met. Who I became inside this marriage. Those are 2 different women. You only ever wanted the second one. The second one was quiet, convenient. She had no needs that disrupted the schedule. She organized your life and your calendar and your household and made herself so small you probably stopped seeing her as a person separate from the furniture. The first one was an architect. She laughed loudly. She had opinions about load-bearing structures, and she raised her voice when she believed something. She was difficult and interesting and fully herself. You weren't interested in her, so she went away. She went very far away, and she stayed away for a very long time. I am bringing her back now. Our daughter deserves to know her. I'm leaving today. Contact about Eleanor goes through Margaret Ford's office. You will be part of her life if you choose to be. That is a permanent offer. This part is over. I'm not angry at you, Derek. I'm grateful. I know how strange that sounds. But I was disappearing long before the affair, and the affair made me stop and look at myself. Really look. So, thank you for that. I hope you become someone worthy of your daughter. I intend to. Done. She stopped the recording. She looked at the screen, the timer, 2 minutes, 14 seconds. She set the phone down on the counter, angled so the screen faced outward. She placed one of Helen's sticky notes beside it with Derek's name written on it in her handwriting. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, the kitchen with the window over the sink and the specific tile and the drawer, pulls she had chosen. Then she picked up her one suitcase, already packed, waiting by the front door. She picked up the leather portfolio case with her name embossed on the handle. Claire Marsh. She walked to the front door. She opened it. October light. The same season she had started in, but warmer now, or she was. The difference was indistinguishable. Helen was waiting at the curb with the car running. Claire looked back at the house once. Then she closed the door. She walked to the car. She got in. Helen did not say anything. She put the car in drive. They drove. Derek Weston came home at 7 in the evening. He told himself, in the car, that he was prepared. He had known the date for 2 weeks. Margaret Ford's office had sent a calendar notification with the precision of something organized by a woman who found disorder offensive. He had known this was the day. He opened the front door. The quality of the air told him immediately. This was not the emptiness of a house while someone was out running errands. This was a different silence, the absence of a person in the way that only certain absences produce. Not a gap, but a completion. A chapter ended, a file closed. He set his keys on the hook by the door. He stood in the entry for a moment. He walked through to the living room. Everything was in its place. The furniture, the art, the accumulated objects of 4 years of a shared life. The divorce process had not yet reached the division of these things. The rooms looked normal, but they were not normal. He went to the kitchen. He saw it immediately. Her phone on the counter, propped against the fruit bowl. A sticky note beside it. His name, her handwriting. Nothing else. He crossed the kitchen. He stood in front of the phone. He picked up the sticky note. He set it down. He picked up the phone. The screen showed a paused video, her face in the thumbnail, her hand on her belly, her eyes looking directly at the camera with a stillness he did not recognize. He had seen her calm before. He had seen her composed. This was something different. This was not the management of emotion. This was the absence of anything to manage. This was a woman on the other side of something. He pressed play. He listened. He stood in his expensive kitchen with the Ethiopian coffee beans in the drawer and the seafoam nursery down the hall and the sound of his wife's voice. His ex-wife, he understood now, though the paperwork had not yet made it official, saying the truest thing anyone had ever said to him in his life. He stood completely still. Layer 7. The transparent mirror. Mirror technique. Moment 8. What he saw in the video was not the woman he had married. Not the woman who had organized his household and smoothed his calendar and hosted his associates and gradually, over 4 years, made herself so efficiently invisible that he had stopped accounting for the full weight of her. Not the woman he had been unfaithful to, not the woman he had disappointed, not the woman he had watched become smaller without understanding that he was watching an architecture collapse. He saw someone he had not met. He saw Claire Marsh. The woman who laughed loudly and had opinions about north-facing light and argued with senior partners and used the word recognize in a specific and precise way that meant something real to her. That came from a place in her that had been building for 32 years before he walked into it and said, on their third date, "You're the most interesting person in any room." And instead of honoring that, instead of actually being curious about the person he had identified as interesting, he had made her smaller, not with cruelty, with carelessness, the most thorough and irreversible kind of damage. He watched the video again. He was aware that he was doing something embarrassing. Standing in a kitchen alone, watching a 2-minute video twice, unable to move. He was aware that this was the specific shape of a consequence and that he had arrived at it through his own choices, systematically, over 4 years, with full agency and almost no awareness. He set the phone down. He looked around the kitchen. The window over the sink that she had argued for with the contractor. He remembered her arguing for it and not understanding why it mattered. He looked at the cabinet where she kept the good olive oil she ordered from a farm in California, which she had explained to him once in detail and which he had listened to with the particular half attention of someone who does not understand yet that the details of a person's loves are the person. He sat down at the kitchen island. Outside, the October dark came in against the windows. Inside, the silence of a life that had been organized by someone else's intelligence and care and then left with great dignity by the person who had been providing it. He sat there for a long time. He pressed play on the video a third time. He listened to her voice. "Thank you for that. I hope you become someone worthy of your daughter." He sat in the kitchen with those words in the air around him. He did not move. The October dark deepened. The clock on the wall marked the time. Tick, tick, tick. He sat. Eleanor Grace Marsh was born on a Thursday morning. 7:42. A timestamp that Claire committed to memory with the precision of someone accustomed to noting exact times in exact places. 7 pounds, 1 ounce. A full head of dark hair, wet and matted, and perfect. Eyes that opened immediately and looked around the room with the specific focused alertness of a person who has somewhere to be and would like to begin. The first sound Eleanor made was not a cry. It was a sound of assessment, a small, serious vocalization, as if she was taking attendance. Claire was the first person Eleanor looked at. Claire looked back. "Hello," she thought. "We finally meet." Helen was in the room. She had been in the room for 9 hours, through the contractions and the transitions and the long middle passage of labor that moves through time at its own pace, unrelated to clocks. She had been there with her hands and her voice and her presence. Without performing, without managing, without offering advice. Just there, the way mothers are there when they understand what being there actually means. When Eleanor arrived, Helen wept silently and competently, the way she did most things, and then composed herself and held her granddaughter with the specific tenderness of a woman who has been waiting to meet this person for a very long time. "Hello, Eleanor," Helen said, her voice completely level, except for the way it wasn't. Rose had driven 60 miles in the pre-dawn dark. She was in the waiting area. She had sent a text at 3 in the morning that said, "I'm here. I'll be in the hallway. Tell me nothing until it's good news." Claire had read it between contractions and felt something warm move through her chest. At 7:42, a nurse walked into the waiting area. Rose looked up. The nurse was smiling. Rose's face did what faces do when 7 months of worry converts, in a single instant, into relief. Derek was also in the waiting area. He had arrived at 2 in the morning when Claire's labor began. He had sent a single text. "I'm here. You don't have to see me. I just want to be close." She had read it and replied with 2 words. "I know." That was the entirety of their exchange. He sat in the orange, plastic chairs under the fluorescent lights and did not sleep. Brendan had driven him. They sat side by side and did not say much because everything that needed to be said between them had been said in 2 separate phone calls over the past month. And what remained was simply the shared acknowledgement of having failed someone they should have protected better. At 8:15, a nurse came out and said, "Mr. Weston, you have a daughter." He said, "I know. Her name is Eleanor." He had learned her name from the email Claire sent 2 weeks before. 3 sentences. The name, its origin, its meaning. Eleanor, it means bright, shining one. He had responded with 2 words. It's perfect. He had meant them in a way that surprised him. He held Eleanor at 10:15. Claire allowed the visit. 10 minutes. She was exhausted in the way that only comes from something being completely completed. Not the exhaustion of depletion, but the exhaustion of arrival. Of having traveled very far and been received. Helen sat in the corner, knitting because her hands needed something to do, and yarn had become, in the last month, the object to which she transferred surplus feeling. Derek came in. He looked at Claire first. She looked at him. There was nothing dramatic in the exchange. 2 people on opposite sides of a finished thing, acknowledging that the thing was finished and that something else, something smaller and more specific, was just beginning. "Hi," he said. "She's here," Claire said. Come meet her." Helen handed Eleanor to him with the efficient competence of a woman who has held babies and seen a great many men hold babies for the first time and is not nervous about either. Secondary ending. Minute 95. He held her. He held her like she might break, which was correct. He held her with his enormous hands, trying to learn a new geometry, the specific and irreducible architecture of 7 pounds of new human. He found the right grip after a moment. He adjusted. He was quiet. Eleanor looked up at him. She had Helen's gray eyes, which Claire had noticed this morning with a private satisfaction she didn't fully examine. She looked up at Derek with the unflinching assessment of someone who has just arrived and is taking measurements. "Hi," he said again. His voice cracked, slightly and honestly, on the single syllable. He stood there for a long time with Eleanor in his arms, not performing, not managing, just present in the specific way that a child who is new to the world will make you present, if you let them. Claire watched this from the bed. She felt something she had not expected. Not love, not longing, not the soft return of something she had put down. Those doors were closed. She had closed them herself, carefully, with full intention. Compassion, the specific kind that does not require anything in return. He was the father of her child. He was a small man who had made large mistakes and would spend years in the accounting of them. He was a man whose consequences were real and proportionate. And underneath all of that, he was a person who was looking at his daughter for the first time and being changed by it. People could be changed. She had been changed. She was standing on the other side of the last 5 months, genuinely changed. She did not recognize herself from before. The before Claire seemed like a photograph. Familiar, clearly the same person, but flat, without depth, without the particular dimensionality that comes from being fully alive inside your own life. She hoped quietly and genuinely that he would be changed too, not for her, for Eleanor. Derek looked up. He looked at Claire. She looked back at him. Everything that needed to pass between them had passed. In the dining room, in the video, in the stillness of his kitchen, everything had been said. "Thank you," he said. She understood the fullness of it. He was thanking her for Eleanor, for the years, for the message, for the truth, for the specific and unlikely gift of having been seen clearly by someone who finally stopped pretending. "Take care of yourself," she said. "She needs you present. Do the work." He nodded. He handed Eleanor carefully to Helen. He looked at his daughter once more. He walked out. The door closed. Helen knitted 1 stitch, 2. Rose came in 5 minutes later and said nothing, and simply held Claire's hand for a while. And that was the right thing. That was exactly the right thing. Tertiary ending, minute 100, 6 weeks later. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building on a street that no one would describe as impressive. The floors were wood and scuffed in a specific pattern that meant history. The kitchen was small and the bathroom was not large enough for 2 people to stand in comfortably. The second bedroom was a room with a window and a closet, and currently a second-hand crib and a mobile. The mobile had paper birds in blue and white. Helen had made them one afternoon while Claire slept from thick paper she had found in Claire's portfolio case. She had hung them from a simple hook she put in the ceiling with a nail and her own certainty that it would hold. It did. The other window, the one in the main room. It faced north. Claire had requested it specifically. The building manager had not understood why, had gestured to the south-facing unit 2 floors up with its dramatic afternoon light and its better views. She had said, patiently and with great certainty, "I need the north-facing one." She had not explained why. She had simply known. She set up her drafting table in front of it. The old drafting table from the studio in the house. Helen had driven her to collect specific items on the day before the move. The drafting table, the portfolio, the ergonomic chair, the drafting supplies in their leather cases, her grandmother's quilt, the picture from 4 years ago, the site visit, the hard hat, the hair loose under it, the laugh. She had left the rest. It was early morning, 6 weeks after Eleanor was born. The city was waking up outside the window. The quality of north-facing light at this hour was exactly what she had remembered. Eleanor was asleep in the next room. Claire was at the drafting table. She was wearing her hair down. The email from the firm was open and on her laptop. The project brief for the Connecticut Library, a public commission, small but serious. The senior partner had written 3 sentences about the reading room, and then, "We want your instinct on the community space. We've seen what you do with light." She was working. She had her coffee, gone slightly cold the way it always went cold when she was working, and forgot about it. The specific problem of the reading room's north wall was in front of her. She had been thinking about it since yesterday afternoon. She had a solution forming in the grid on her laptop, a way of introducing a clerestory window that would bring in the high north light without compromising the shelving wall. It was a good solution. She was certain of it, with the certainty of someone who has spent years learning the precise language of a discipline and then spent years away from it and returned to find the language still present, still fluent, still completely hers. She typed 3 lines into the project document. She looked at the north-facing window. The morning came in through it, clean and cool and honest, the way north light always is, the way she had always described it. Livable. Not dramatic, not performing anything, just consistently, reliably present. Mirror technique. Final moment. She looked at her reflection in the window glass, the faint transparency of it in the morning light. She could see both. The room behind her and herself within it. Her face, her hair down, her hands on the keyboard, the drafting table beneath her. Her own life, assembled in a room she had chosen, at a window she had chosen, doing work she had chosen. She looked like herself. She looked entirely like herself. Somewhere else in the city, in a large house on a good street, a man sat at a kitchen island before leaving for work. He had his coffee. Ethiopian blend, new shipment. He had his phone on the counter. He had the morning news on his laptop. He also had, in the browsers recently visited, the tab he had opened last night, an architecture firm's website, a profile page, a headshot of a woman with dark hair looking directly at the camera with a confidence that had always been there, that had always been hers, that he had spent 4 years obscuring without understanding. That was what he was doing. He read her name on the page, Claire Marsh, residential and civic architecture. He read the line beneath it. She believes the most important thing a building can do is make people feel recognized. He sat with his coffee in the kitchen. He had played the video again last night. The 4th time, maybe the 5th, he had stopped counting. He understood now something he had not understood before, not the affair, not the betrayal. Those were simple enough to understand. You did a thing, the thing had a cost. You paid it. He understood the other thing. The longer, slower, quieter thing. The way he had stood in front of someone extraordinary and spent 4 years making her ordinary. Not because she was orderable, because she was extraordinary, and that frightened him in a way he had never acknowledged. She had been the most interesting person in any room she walked into. He had spent 4 years teaching her not to walk into rooms that way, and she had gone back to herself anyway. She had gone back to herself with a completeness and a certainty and a grace that he had nothing to do with. He sat in his kitchen. Outside, the October morning had become November. The magnolia tree in the garden had released most of its leaves. It stood clean and bare against the gray sky, all its structure visible now. The way things are visible when they are stripped of their decoration. He finished his coffee. He went to work. In the apartment on the third floor of a building on an unimpressive street, Claire Marsh was working. The morning came in through the north-facing window. Eleanor slept. The drafting table held its careful geometry. The problem of the reading room's north wall was almost solved. She typed another line. She smiled. The real one, the full one, the loud one. The one she did not cover with her hand anymore. Outside, the morning continued. Inside, a woman was doing her work. The work she was made for. In the room she had chosen. In the light she had always known was hers.
Claire did not leave because she was angry. She left because she finally stopped being afraid. And that distinction, that small, enormous distinction, is the whole lesson. We talk a lot about betrayal, about affairs, about the dramatic, visible moment when a marriage breaks. But the truth that this story tries to hold, the truth that is harder to name and harder to face, is that Claire's marriage had been breaking long before the keycard. It had been breaking the first time she decided not to argue. The first time she made herself quieter, so the room felt more comfortable for someone else. The first time she looked at the north-facing windows in her studio and thought, maybe next year. Betrayal does not always arrive as infidelity. Sometimes it arrives as the slow erosion of a woman's selfhood, and sometimes the person doing the eroding is not the husband. Sometimes it is ourselves. Claire's real journey in this story is not the confrontation. It is not the message she left on the kitchen counter. It is the moment in the storage room, her old drafting chair, her old portfolio, the blank grid on her laptop screen, when she looked at the woman she used to be and felt grief. Not for the marriage, for herself. That is the moment the story is really about. Because here is what is true. When you spend years making yourself smaller, you do not notice it happening. You call it compromise. You call it love. You call it being practical. You say, this is what partnership requires. This is what marriage looks like. This is what a woman does when she has built a life with someone. And then one day, something small happens. A key card in a pocket. A friend's long overdue honesty. A photograph of yourself from 4 years ago, laughing with your mouth wide open, your hair loose, your whole face unguarded. And you realize that woman is still there. She never left. She is waiting for you to stop apologizing for taking up space. The most important thing this story offers is not the ending, not the message video, not Derek standing frozen, not the justice of Claire returning to her own name and her own work and her own window. The most important moment is quieter than all of that. It is Claire, alone in the dark at 2 a.m, asking the question she has been most afraid of. If I am not his wife, who am I? And then staying in the question, not running from it, not filling it with plans or anger or distraction, just sitting with the terrifying, necessary emptiness of it, because you cannot rebuild yourself until you have honestly assessed the damage. You cannot find your way back to yourself until you admit, clearly and without softening, that you got lost. And you cannot move forward with dignity until you understand that the prison door, the one you believed locked from the outside, has been open from the inside the whole time. Claire did not need Derek's permission to leave. She did not need his remorse. She did not need his collapse. She needed her own clarity. She needed to sit in the guest room with her grandmother's quilt and her old portfolio and the smell of someone who had loved her before she learned to doubt herself. She needed to open the blank drafting grid and sit with its potential without filling it too quickly. She needed the north-facing light and the cheap daisies from the grocery store and her mother's lemon chicken and the sound of a friend's real laugh. She needed, in other words, herself. The self she had been setting aside for years, one small accommodation at a time. And this is the lesson. Not that you should leave, not that you should stay. Not a prescription for any particular choice. The lesson is this: you are not less because you loved someone fully. You are not foolish because you trusted. You are not weak because you stayed too long. But you are responsible to yourself and to every younger version of yourself who believed you were worth fighting for. To stop pretending that shrinking is the same as giving. Love does not require you to disappear. Partnership does not require you to become invisible. And the moment you understand that, the moment it lands not as an idea, but as a physical certainty in the center of your chest, that is the moment your story changes. Not with a confrontation, not with a dramatic exit, with a decision, quiet and final and entirely yours. Eleanor Grace Marsh came into the world on a Thursday morning, 7:42, 7 pounds and 1 ounce, eyes open, already taking measurements. Her mother was waiting for her, all of her mother, the whole version, the loud laughing, north window finding, portfolio carrying, clear-eyed, fully present version. The one who had been missing for 4 years, the one who was finally, completely, home. This content was manually researched, developed, and edited by our team, built with intention, care, and the genuine belief that every woman who has ever made herself smaller for someone else's comfort deserves to hear a story that sees her clearly, names what she survived, and holds open the door she has always had the power to walk through.